I'm going to just introduce Kleber and AES, and we're gonna spend 15-20 minutes just covering a range of topics from the obviously the issues related to Ukraine in terms of how that's driving the nexus of climate policy and energy security policy, and also then take a look at some of the new emerging clean tech technologies, hydrogen power, offshore wind, carbon storage, battery energy storage systems. But let me just start out. So Kleber is the Chief Commercial Officer of AES Clean Energy. He was appointed to that position in 2020. Previous to that, he had regional responsibility in that role for Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean. He got 20 years of experience in the energy sector across power, natural gas, oil, and LNG. So it comes with a wealth of experience and background and perspective. For those of you who don't know AES, AES is one of the world's leading power companies, actually established in 1981. It was one of the first IPPs, independent power producers in the US. So a pioneering company in terms of private investment in power generation and distribution. I think the company has over 30,000 megawatts of installed capacity, operating in 15 countries. So a major player in the energy and the power sector. I wanted to just start off, Kleber, if we could, because I think this is relevant and interesting. You know, I cut my teeth in project finance, infrastructure finance in the 90s, working on a number of AES projects. And AES, like a lot of power companies, was very much a fossil fuel generating company. AES has successfully made a dramatic transition to clean tech, sustainable, renewable energy. If you look back maybe 10 years ago, I think about 40% of AES's installed capacity was coal-fired. That's now 20%. And I think the company just made a very historic announcement in February this year to exit coal-fired generation by 2025 through retirements or retrofitting. I thought it'd be interesting, to be honest, just to kind of talk a little bit about AES's transition to clean tech and being and becoming a renewable energy company.
I appreciate that, Paul. Thank you, and thank you everyone for having me here. Thanks, Paul, and thanks the Columbia University MBA students and faculty. I think it's fascinating to hear when you talk about AES having started in 1981, and I wasn't thinking of even mentioning that, but AES started with a dream, with a mission of two founders of bringing reliable and safe electricity to a lot of parts of the world that didn't have access to that at the time. So over the years, if you look at the countries that AES moved into over the following decades, the 80s and the 90s, it was a true IPP in the sense of going into markets, some of them that didn't have a lot of regulation and policy that were conducive to IPPs, but we would go into those markets, work with the local stakeholders, and deploy generation. Electricity generation at the time, the cheapest, most reliable and safest they were thermal generation. So you saw a large deployment of, there was some hydro too, but you saw a large deployment of coal and natural gas generation in some of those markets. I think when you fast forward to a little over 10 years ago, our current CEO, when he took the helms of the company, he made a decision to transition the company into a renewable company. So it has been a long journey. and we're very proud of what we have accomplished during this past 10 years and what we're continuing working towards. Turns out today that renewable energy has become the safest, cheapest, and with the right deployment of technology and with the right investment in infrastructure, a safe, reliable source of generation. So I feel like, in a way, what we are doing today, transforming the company into a large renewable player, is what the founders' vision were in 1981. But there was a bridge to get there, and that bridge was done with coal and natural gas at the time. So they were working very hard with our stakeholders, with our customers, with local communities to retire those coals, displace those coal plants, and move heavily into renewable electricity, which is very much aligned with our own ESG goals and also with our customers' ESG goals. So in practice, that means that over the past few years, we have been on a mission to exit almost 12 gigawatts of coal generation, which, if you remember, Paul mentioned, we have today about 30 gigawatts of installed capacity. So it's almost half of our current asset base. And of course, we need to replace that with renewables. So we have been working in Chile with a number of our customers on this strategy that we call Green Blend and Extend, which is to convert existing current PPAs with customers, power purchase agreement with customers associated with coal plants into renewables. In the United States, we have consolidated our renewables business into what we now call AES Clean Energy. And we are currently deploying over 15 gigawatts as we speak in construction or in backlog in order to decarbonize our fleet in the US as well. So what that strategy has done, in addition to aligning us with, again, our original mission and vision, and with the goals of our customers and other stakeholders, that has catapulted us into one of the top renewable players in the United States. Last year, according to Bloomberg, BNEF, we sold more PPAs, more power purchase agreements to corporates than any other developer globally. And so I think, in parallel to creating these sustainable and innovative solutions to our customers, we're also keep in mind the work with our communities and other stakeholders to, again, deliver that safe and reliable energy, which has always been our mission since our founding partners.
Thanks, Kleber. And certainly, my experience with AES is the company's always been highly innovative, always sort of been on the cutting edge in terms of identifying the trends in the energy sector and positioning well ahead of everyone else. So the company's always been a barometer for shifts in the energy sector, and clearly, the shift towards clean tech, renewable energy is something that is just accelerating, and obviously we can't sort of not address what the implications are for clean tech transition with what's happening in Ukraine. A lot of the panel today have already talked about the whether that's going to accelerate the transition to green energy or complicate it. Just a few quick data points. The EU has revamped its energy policy to treble installed renewable capacity by 2030, with a view to basically weaning the continent off of Russian gas, 2/3 this year, zero dependency by 2030, which is very ambitious goals. Germany, which is the largest gas dependent major European economy, has announced $200 billion capital spending to move the country to 100% renewable by 2035 through investment in rooftop solar, renewable hydrogen. They originally had intended to become 100% renewable by 2050. But at the same time, natural gas is going to be need to be sourced from other locations. Germany said that they're going to spend $1.5 billion trying to source additional supplies from Qatar, US, Australia. Obviously, that's going to take time. But the nexus, the intersection of climate policy and energy security policy has accelerated dramatically. And AES is positioned in Europe already. How do you see, just from a private sector perspective, the opportunity space developing? Is AES very optimistic about the future renewables in Europe? Do you see that playing out positively and accelerating the transition to green energy?
Well, thanks for that, Paul, and also thanks for mentioning innovation there. I think innovation is is in the DNA of AES and the AES team members. I think I find fascinating how renewables can play a major role, not only in what we have been doing until now, until very recently, in decarbonizing the world and in supporting efforts against climate change, but also how it could now play a major role in providing energy security to global energy security, right? Not only to the US, but also to our allies and to other parts of the world. So just let me give you some numbers here because I think it's important, right? In 2021, according to the Energy Department, the US generated about 600 terawatt hours of energy from non-hydro renewable power sources. That means wind and solar, basically. That's about 14% of the total generation in the US. Natural gas, with the retirement of coal plants, has been gaining market share in electricity generation. In 2022 will be the first year that natural gas will lose market share against renewables. So what's happening here? Coal retirement continuing. Natural gas stepped in for a while as a transition to replace coal, and now renewable coming back to gain market share from natural gas, right? If all the US natural gas exports, all the US LNG exports were, instead of being exported, used to generate electricity in the US, we would be able to produce approximately, coincidentally, the same 600 terawatt hours. So that gives you an idea of the magnitude of the renewable generation, the order of magnitude that the renewable generation can displace natural gas, and as such, free up natural gas to be exported to Europe. Let's focus on Europe here because that's where the current problem is. So we think that if the US, so the US started, keep in mind that the US started exporting gas, LNG, to Europe in 2017. And today is the largest supplier ahead of Qatar and Russia. So if the US stays on track on deploying renewable energy, approximately 30 gigawatts of new wind and solar every year, and we of course we want to be a big player here. Today we have about 10 to 12% of that market share. We think we could double gas exports to Europe within the next decade, right? So that's how Europe is coming up with these goals. Deployment of renewables across Europe is also a big part of that goal, but I think natural gas will play an important role here, especially during the transition. How do you deploy 30 gigawatts a year within the next decade without addressing all the issues that renewable energy have, particularly the intermittency of solar and wind generation, and also the fact that sometimes the places with good renewable resources are not close to the load, where you actually need the load. Well, we have been very much focused on the innovation aspects of bridging that gap between projects, solar and wind projects, and load. How do we do that? By deploying energy storage. We're first starting with lithium-based energy storage, which takes care of the intraday discrepancy between generation and load. We also looking into hydrogen. We think green hydrogen would be a game changer. That will take care of more of an intra-seasonal discrepancy between generation and load. But also we need a large deployment of infrastructure, particularly with transmission. The New York State's a perfect example, right? The New York State has very aggressive renewable targets. You can't decarbonize New York State without decarbonizing New York City. The only way that you do that is with development of transmission from upstate or from the west into the city, and also now more recently we've been looking into offshore wind as well. So I think this was a long way of saying we see renewable playing a major role in displacing gas in order for us to increase the energy security of the world with US LNG, combined with Europe deploying renewables in large scale as well.
No, it's very interesting, Laura. So it's really a multifaceted approach to addressing both energy security and climate policy at the same time. And you mentioned offshore wind. We saw a landmark transaction with the project financing in September of last year of the Vineyard Wind offshore wind project, the very first offshore wind project, utility scale offshore wind project to reach financial close and start construction in the US off of Martha's Vineyard. It's an 800 megawatt project. Is that the leading edge of, you think, excused upon, of a wave of offshore wind? And in that vein, do you see battery energy storage systems and carbon storage as sort of commercially viable technologies now that can be implemented and rolled out? And how do you see those frontier clean energy markets developing?
I think it all started, and let's leave, I mean, there has been a tremendous amount of technological development in wind and solar over the past decades, right? If you start, when I first graduated from business school and I started working in the renewable space, we had 300 kilowatt wind turbines, and now we talk about 5 to 10 gigawatts onshore, right? If you go offshore, it could be even bigger. But I think the frontier for the renewable industry is now in storage, right? So again, as I said, I think 10 years ago or 15 years ago, we were pioneers in battery deployment in the United States and in certain other places in the world, Chile and other places in Latin America, to be more specifically. Today, we have economic 4-hour to 6-hour duration lithium storage. That is transformational and will continue transforming the industry, but that mostly takes care of when the solar is not shining during the day or when the wind is not blowing during the day. So the intraday charge and discharge of the energy storage is taken care of. I think the other game changer is green hydrogen, which is really a way for you to decarbonize industries that would be very difficult to decarbonize or through electrification. So green hydrogen and synthetic fuels, I think, is where we are today on the next frontier. Right? Probably where battery storage was 5 years ago. I think offshore wind is another frontier technology here. Probably is where battery storage was 10 years ago. I think the challenge with offshore wind, the same challenge that we see in oil and gas offshore exploration. So there's a lot of technology for that, but you need transmission, you need permitting, and you need the cost of energy, what we call the levelized cost of energy, to come down a little bit more for offshore wind to be large in scale, without a lot of policy, right? I think what you're seeing in some markets, what you see in Europe, what you see in some markets in the US, is heavy policy incentives to deploy offshore wind. The advantage of offshore wind is that you can deploy them closer to the load, and also in places where you have large thermal generation on the shore, you can use the same transmission infrastructure that you have for the thermal generation, and bring the offshore wind in onshore through that same infrastructure, right? So I think as you said, Paul, it's multifaceted. I do believe offshore wind is a major component of that 100% decarbonization of the grid that we all aim at achieving in the future.
Yeah, and I mean, and to your point, if we look 10 years back, where onshore wind and utility scale solar was, in terms of economics, the levelized cost of utility scale solar and onshore wind was, $100, $150 a megawatt hour. It's now $20, $30 a megawatt hour, right? So it's cheaper than combined cycle and coal. Offshore wind is still $80, $90 kind of PPA, power purchase agreement range. That is coming down, and I'm sure in 5 to 10 years, it will reach grid parity and be a competitive source. I'm conscious that we're sort of coming towards the end of our chat, and it's been super interesting. But just to allow maybe some time for questions from the audience. I don't know, Michelle, like if we have some questions from folks, you can raise your hand, or you can pose your question in the chat box. Any questions for Kleber from the audience?
Yes, thank you so much, Paul and Kleber. The first question we have is from Mihir. He asks if you think green hydrogen will play the same role in a decarbonized economy that natural gas does currently, and if not, what role do you think green hydrogen will play? I know you mentioned a little bit about green hydrogen, but more context would be appreciated.
No, very much so. I think as I mentioned briefly, I think green hydrogen will be a vehicle to decarbonize a number of industries, especially the liquid fuel heavy industry, that it would be hard to be decarbonized through electrification, right? So I do think not only in terms of long-term storage, but also in terms of decarbonizing the transportation sector and other sectors that would be harder to decarbonize. I think green hydrogen is already here. I think we're not too far from making that economic in large scale. Thanks for the question.
Excellent. And another question is related to AES strategy in relation to supply chain. The attendee wants to know what steps is AES taking to secure rare earth materials or supply any sort of supply chain commodities related in today's environment, and what's the outlook?
No, that's an excellent question. And that's very much also associated with energy security, right? Because we talk about renewables displacing natural gas in order to free up LNG exports. But if we don't address the supply chain, especially from solar panels, we're now moving away from dependency on Russia to dependency on China. So I think that is very much in focus of the Biden administration. I think it's very much focus of AES as well to diversify our sources of supply, not only solar panels, but all the equipment that we need for renewable energy. I think the fact that we are a global company, we have projects in a number of different countries across the globe, help us have a diversified source of supply, and also enables us to move panels and other equipment around as needed in order to comply with our project development needs. But that's an excellent question. Thank you.
Great, thanks for that question. Michelle, any last questions? I know we're coming to the end of our time, so we
have a series of other questions, but given time, we will be moving to the next session.
Okay. So let me just close by thanking Kleber for taking the time to address the energy symposium, and to the organizers for putting it together. It's been very short but very interesting. So thanks again, Kleber. Appreciate it.
Thank you again, Paul. Thank you everyone for having me here, and had a lot of fun talking to you all. Sorry that we couldn't cover more questions here, but look forward to the next opportunity. So thank you all.
All right.